In my last video I was talking about my league start strategy for the upcoming league, and today I want to show you my league starter build, which is going to be Armageddon Brand Hierophant into Stormbrand Inquisitor. The reason why I'm starting with Armageddon Brand is because I want to reach red maps as fast as possible, and Armageddon Brand is extremely good at doing that on low investment. Unfortunately, in red maps, especially if you juice your maps to maximum, it starts to fall off, but that's why I am planning to swap into Stormbrand, which scales with investment extremely well. Before I move on to the guide, I quickly want to mention that I am not the best at making builds, so I mostly focus on making currency, and then I just fix my build with big investment. Because of this, my Armageddon brand version is mostly based on Jungroan's version of the build, which he made video about last week. So if you want to check it out, I'm going to link it under the video. And when it comes to the Stormbrand, there's no one better at playing it than Zeeboub, who has been playing Stormbrand every single league for the last few years. And what he did this league is he made 35-page document with all information about Stormbrand. So if you want to learn more about this build, you can check it out, and also you can check out his stream on Twitch. I'm going to link both of them under this video. Okay, so let's move on to the build, starting with how I'm going to level it up. So here is the POE of the build, and I'm also gonna link it under the video. Here in the notes you can check all of the progression from Act 1 up to Act 10. In 3 you can see all of the 3 progression steps. On items, I did put items that I'm expecting to have at some point between white and yellow maps. Most of them you can buy on trade for a few chaos, or you can craft them yourself. And same thing with flasks. In skills, this is my endgame setup for skills, assuming I'm going to have a 5-link. For 6-link, I probably would go for concentrated effect, but the issue of concentrated effect is that it reduces your AoE, which is not that great for Armageddon brand. So for 6-link, I probably will be respecing into crit, but more on that a bit later. And here you can see all of the other skills that I'm planning to use at the end. So now let's go over the leveling. So the way you would level this build, you would start with Ranger, because Ranger gets momentum support, and then you put it to your stash and you start Templar. You also want to copy this text, and then you want to use it to search at the vendor for movement speed boots and free blue socket items, which is the free link you're going to need for these skills. So the first skill of choice is going to be Rolling Magma, which you can get from completing the first quest, and you get Elemental Proliferation at the beginning when you start Templar, so that would be your tooling. And from the second quest you get the Arcane Sword, so that would be your first thrilling. For mobility, you're gonna use Frostblink. Holy Flame Totem helps a little bit with damage, but it also is very helpful on bosses because you can put it right on top of the boss, and bosses from time to time are going to attack it, which gives you a lot of free time to just cast your rolling magma without having to avoid boss attacks. Firewall is extremely good for rolling magma because you can place it in between boss and you, and when you're gonna throw rolling magma, it's gonna increase the damage of it. And then War Banner is pretty good because you can use it on bosses for adrenaline for short bursts of damage, but it definitely would be my lowest priority. Then at level 8 you can get Combustion, so you would replace Arcane Surge with Combustion and then use Arcane Surge with Frostblink. And if you don't get Thrilling early on, I wouldn't worry about it too much. During one of my runs I did get only tooling until like middle of Act 2, and I still was fine with it. And then I actually forgot about getting a 4-link, and I was playing with a thrilling until the end of Act 8, and it still was perfectly fine. Obviously you would prefer to have a 4-link, it helps a little bit, but you are not super reliant of having a 4-link. And actually I probably, at this point, if I only had 2-link, I would use Rolling Magma with Combustion, and I would use Elemental Prolif to get third one. And like I said, you use Arcane Surge with Frostblink. At level 10, you want to start using Leap Slam with Momentum, which we got from the Ranger, for mobility. And at this point, you want to buy one axe and sword, or 2 swords or 2 axes, but preferably 1 axe and sword for high attack speed, because up until this point you use scepters, which have very slow attack speed, or you use wands, but wands with them you can't use leap stab, so you want to use axes and swords because they are pretty fast. And preferably you use 1 axe and 1 sword, because later you will get this mastery which gives 60% increased damage when you use 2 different weapon types. So that's why you want to use 1 axe and 1 sword. Then in Act 2 you get your Herald, so you would probably get Herald of Ash from the quest, and you buy from the vendor Herald of Thunder. And you can also get Brand Recall and Wave of Conviction, which we are going to use later once we get Armageddon Brand. And for bandits, you just want to kill all. Then in Act 3, we finally will be swapping to the main skill, which is Armageddon Brand, once you kill Gravicious. And you want to link it with Elemental Proliferation, Combustion, and if you can get Falling at this point, you don't have any great options, so I probably would just use Arcane Surge, which would mean you would need 4 blue sockets. And then you use Brand Recall. And the way you play with this build is you want to cast your 6 Armageddon Brands, or if you're going through mobs, you only need to cast like 2 or 3, but on bosses you would cast all 6 of them. And then you want to use your Brand Recall, and when you press it, you're gonna recall all of your brands to you, and all of them are gonna hit the ground once, which means if boss is in that area, all of them are gonna hit the boss. So it's gonna deal huge amount of damage. And everything else stays the same. The only exception is now we use Wave of Conviction, because when you hit an enemy with it, it's gonna have less resistances, and the same thing with Flammability. So when you are fighting bosses, you want to use Wave of Conviction and Flammability time to time to debuff the enemies. And at the end of Solaris Temple level 2, you want to go to the side room, and over there you can get Recipe, which is added fire damage to spells. You want to craft it on both weapons, which is 4 transmutation each. So you're gonna need 8 transmutations, and at this point you probably also want to craft resistances on your gear, which means you will need even more transmutes. So I would highly recommend getting as many yellow and blue items, not identifying them and just selling them to vendor for a lot of transmutation shards, because you're probably going to need like 20 transmutations, maybe even more throughout the thing. And as an optional link, you can use Cremation with Elemental Focus and Concentrated Effect. And if you get 4 link, you can also add Immolate 4. And Desecration for spawning corpses, because Cremation requires corpses. And this is going to help you with single target, but to be honest, Armageddon Brand already deals a high amount of damage, so it's not super needed. But if you get another 4 link, so you have a lot of sockets, I highly recommend using it. But if you can't get it, I wouldn't stress over it too much. It's gonna be perfectly fine with just Armageddon Brand. And then in Act 4, like I said, you get Immolate, so you can put Immolate as a 4 link to Armageddon Brand, and if you have Cremation, also to your Cremation. And then in Act 6, we only change 2 or 3 things. So first thing is Fire Penetration instead of Elemental Proliferation for Armageddon Brand link. And for Leaf Slam, now we use faster attacks instead of momentum. For auras, you can use at this point Anger plus Herald of Ash, or Anger with Determination. You probably will go for Anger with Determination. You should have enough mana reservation efficiency at this point to use both of them, because you're gonna struggle with survivability. And you still use with Conviction with Flammability. If you have enough reservation, you should just use all 3 of them. But for that, you are gonna need a lot of mana, and you probably will want to be Eldritch Battery at this point, which is what I'm gonna do second. But the biggest issue at this point is actually going to be your mana. And actually, even in Act 3, you're gonna start struggling with mana. And unfortunately, there is no easy solution for it. You're gonna just constantly run into mana issues, especially if you put your Brand Recall on the left click, which is what I recommend doing it. Gonna automate your Brand Recalling. You're gonna just burn through your mana, and the only solution for it is to just press your mana flask as much as you can. Preferably use even 2 mana flasks. You can also use Clarity, but Clarity is gonna also reserve some of your mana, which is not ideal. If you can go for Mana Mastery, like here, which gives regenerate 5 mana per second. You can get some extra mana from passives, maybe from an item, but I wouldn't worry about it too much. The biggest thing for you is just gonna be pressing your mask as much as you can. Okay, so now let's go over the tree. So you would start, of course, as a Templar. We go to the left and we take these points for additional attack speed and cast speed. Attack speed is gonna help for Leap Slam, and cast speed for casting Rolling Magma and Armageddon Brand. And dexterity is also pretty important for being able to equip some of the items, especially sword at level 10. Then we go up here and we get the Fire Mastery. So this is going to give you 100% increased damage against ignited enemies, but you can't ignite with crits. This is huge amount of damage at this point, and to be able to ignite enemies, we are using the Elemental Proliferation with Combustion, so this way you're just gonna have pretty decent chance at igniting, and later on also Flammability gives you a chance to ignite enemies. And then we go, like I said earlier, here for the Dual Wielding Mastery for additional 60% damage. So in total you get 160% increased damage, which is pretty big, and also some increased attack speed here for the ability. Then at level 32 you're gonna get your first lab. I recommend going for Sign of Purpose for reduced cooldown of Brand Recall. If you want more survivability, you can go for Conviction of Power for endurance charges, but I am just focusing on damage, so I'm going for this. But definitely, if you go for Sign of Purpose, you're gonna struggle a bit more with mana, because obviously you're gonna cast your Brand Recall more often. And then for the passive, you want to start going for Spiritual Command for even more attack speed, for Leap Slam, and obviously at this point, around level 28, I think is a requirement for Armageddon Brand, you will swap to Brand, so you'll go for Rune Binder for additional Brand, being able to be attached to enemies. Here you get some additional damage with Brands, and you can cast 2 additional Brands. And here you also go for Overload for even more damage. And here you get some additional life, resistances, and elemental damage. Then at 54, we get a second trial, and at this point you actually have a lot of choices. To be honest, I've seen a lot of different content creators choosing all of the different options. Most popular one is going for Sign of Purpose, Conviction of Power, then Divine Guidance, and Sanctuary of Thought. But for me personally, what worked the best is going for Arcane Blessing, then Illuminated Devotion, and then Conviction of Power. Because this way you get a ton of damage from Arcane Blessing, especially with additional 20% increased effect of Arcane Surge here, and also later you can go here and here. So you get in total 80% increased effect of Arcane Surge, which means you get around 36% more damage from this node. And here you also get Spell Leech, life spell leech from when you have Arcane Surge on you. And getting Energy Shield leech with spells is actually kind of easy, but getting life leech with spells is not super common, so this is why this is pretty good. Area of Effect is decent for Armageddon Brand, but it's not too crazy, and Reduce Effect of non-damaging ailments is also a decent thing, but mostly focus on leech. And if I would get Leech, then I would go for something else like Divine Guidance. And then at Uber Lab, I go for Conviction of Power for endurance charges. And at this point, you want to go to top to get the second Brand Mastery. This way you can cast 2 additional Brands, and your Brand Recall has 50% reduced cooldown. 50% increased cooldown recovery rate. And after that, you will probably want to go for Mana Reservation nodes here, so you can fit more auras. And then for Fire Mastery, so you just get more damage, more life here, get plus 50 additional life, get additional penetration, and here you can also get 15% increased life when you don't have life body armor. So it's pretty important to not have any chest. And then here you can also get some additional armor and life generation. Then at level 72, so that would be when you would reach maps, that's when you would actually spec out of Leap Slam and you would go for Shield Charge. So you would remove these points, you would remove these points. You actually can keep this just for additional attack speed, but I would probably remove it. You can also start traveling through here, so you spend less points. and you would go for Mind over Matter, because at this point you would have Eldritch Battery. And that's actually the first thing I would go for. After this tree, I would immediately start progressing toward Eldritch Battery, so you will no longer have mana issues once you get this. And to help with Energy Shield Sustain, you would go for Energy Shield Leech, and especially for Leech Mastery, which gives you 10% of Leech instant, which is very helpful for Energy Shield. And then eventually, when you get your Merclap, you're also gonna have Life Leech, and with this, some of that Leech is gonna be instant. And then you go to the right side, you get even more Reservation Mastery. So at this point, you definitely should be able to fit 3 auras, especially with Eldritch Battery. And then you go for some additional life and energy shield, because now we are scaling both life and energy shield for defenses and, well, being able to cast skills. And after that, to be honest, there is not that much to go for. Oh, also I forgot to mention, yeah, you go for Arcane Surge here, and here Mana Reservation Mastery. So at this point I would go here for some additional elemental damage, and spell suppression in here, and your chance to spell suppress is lucky. So at this point you actually will have around 50% spell suppression, which is actually pretty good, especially considering we are Templar, so we don't have great access to spell suppression. Having 50% is actually not that bad. And for the items, at this point I would go for shield, for shield charge instead of lip slamming, and as a weapon I would use a scepter with +1 fire spells. Everything else, whatever you can get, just spell damage, crit chance. Well, crit chance is actually going to be helpful later, which is talk about in a second. And for a shield, you just want defensive stats like life, resistances. If you can, obviously go for something like +1 fire skills or spell damage and so on, but I would focus on life and resist at this point. And one very important thing at this point is going for armor and energy shield bases. So you want to have as much armor and energy shield as possible, because we don't have that great access to energy shield. So the only way to get huge amount of energy shield is from bases, because I am not going for Sanctuary Thought, with normally you would just get a lot of energy shield from mana. So I'm not going for it, so I need a lot of energy shield on my gear. So every single piece of my gear in here, so helmet, body armor, gloves and boots, have armor and energy shield. And armor is obviously pretty good for physical damage mitigation, especially when I'm going for Determination and Granite Flask. I have a 21k armor, which is pretty good. So again, on helmet, just life, resists, and energy shield with armor. Same thing on chest. You actually don't want to have life on chest because of the life mastery. And then gloves, same thing, resists, energy shield, armor, boots. You also want movement speed, which means you probably will not have that great other stats. And on amulet, you want +1 to fire spell skills, some life, resistances, and you will probably need some dexterity and strength, because you actually need 111 dexterity and 155 strength to fit all of sockets. Then on the rings, same thing, you want additional stats if you can get it, and especially with upcoming tattoos for the next league, you're probably going to need even more attributes, because you're going to use some of the tattoos. Or maybe you will just reduce some of the levels of your skills. So for dexterity, that would be faster attacks. And as a crafting mod, you can craft a minus mana cost, which is not super important, but if you can get it, go for it. And for the belt, the one important thing about the belt is you can get Veiled Mod or regenerate 150 energy per second when there is a rare or unique enemy nearby. This is gonna help with your energy shield sustain a ton, which obviously helps with your defense because we are matter build. For flasks, just go for instant flask with bleed immunity. This is the least important flask, quartz. It's gonna give you spell suppression. Phasing is actually very important, but you also can get phasing from this jewel kill, so you can get it this way. If you don't, you just use quartz flask. Granite flask with additional armor, so 40% increase armor. You can get it even higher. It's pretty important. Silver flask with onslaught. Here, crafted mob doesn't really matter that much. You can get attack speed, you can get cast speed, doesn't really matter too much. And quicksilver Here I just got critical strike chance. You can get additional movement speed, of course. It doesn't matter too much. The most important things is increased armor and freeze immunity and bleeding. And then after being level 72, you are probably going to run out of things to spend your points on. There are a few things, obviously, you still can go for. Like you can go in this area and you can go for spell suppression. You can go for some additional spell damage over here and here. Maybe some life over here and here. But there is nothing too crazy. So at this point, I actually would respec in crit. So here's the level 89 tree. So you would go for crit chance over here and over here. I would go for +1 power charge. At this point you would have 4 minimum and +1 max. This way you get additional 1 max. And here you can get +1 minimum. So this way you would have 5 power charges. And you would get some additional power charge scaling from here. For master, you actually can go for anything in here. You can get ignite immunity, chill immunity, shock immunity if you really want one of them, or you just can get some additional damage per charge. And we remove some points from elemental overload. And that's basically it. You probably will also need some additional stats. So here I took some strength and dexterity. And that's why at this point you also can go for some additional crit chance on your gear. And for your skills, you would remove the combustion and immolate and arcane surge. You probably would go for both crit gems, so crit damage and crit strikes. And as a fifth link, you can go for either concentrated effect or combustion. I actually probably at this point would use combustion on a wave of conviction, so enable it here, so you still can get additional fire pen, and then you can go for immolate in here. You still will ignite your enemies with Armageddon brand thanks to some ignite chance from the ability, so that probably would be my 5 link. I would probably still test concentrated effect. If it doesn't feel too bad, I would go for it because it actually gives a lot of damage. And as a 6 link, that's probably what I would go for. And for the items, once you go for crit, you actually have few options that you can go for. For example, there is Light of Lunaris, which gives a ton of crit multi. So it gives you crit multi depending on your block chance. So at this point, you can go for glancing blows and some block points in here, and mastery, which gives even more crit multi per energy shield on your shield. So this way you should have around spell block cap. Here I have 60%. Let me change the shield to this one, and I have 75%, and you get a ton of crit multi. So this is actually pretty good shield. Then there is a second one, and this one is probably gonna be pretty expensive. I probably wouldn't go for it. And with this one, you can scale crit with your life and your damage with your life. So at this point, you would basically scale as much life as possible, and you get a ton of damage this way. But like I said, this shield is probably gonna be pretty expensive, and it makes you scale this pretty specifically with your life. For the helmet, you can go for Hrimroar's Resolve, which is pretty good. It gives you freeze and chill immunity. You don't need it on the flask, and it's more consistent. And it gives you a ton of armor. Unfortunately, it doesn't give any energy shield, but still 700 armor is pretty good. And it still gives some life and resists. For gloves, there is nothing really too great. One thing I want to mention is that you can go for the armor and evasion hybrid item, or energy shield and evasion hybrid, and this way you can get some spell suppression. So if you want more defense against spells, I would suggest going for these type of bases. So probably gloves, maybe boots, maybe chest, whatever, just any item that can give you some spell suppression. So it's gonna be up to you to decide how much armor, how much energy shield, and how much spell suppression you want. And obviously spell suppression items might be pretty expensive early on. And for the boots, there's nothing really crazy. You just stick with movement speed boots. For the rings, you can use Death Rush for adrenaline, for clear, but it's probably also gonna be expensive early on. And for the belt, if people are gonna start killing Maven, this belt drops from her. And this one is gonna transfer your endurance charges into brutal charges. This way you will get a ton of damage, because brutal charges gives more damage per charge, but you will lose endurance charges, which means you will lose defense. So as you can see from effective life pool, 31k dropped down to 25k, but DPS average hit 290k, and without it is 230k. So it's definitely good amount of damage. So it's up to you to decide what to go for. And at this point, I probably would stop investing into this build too much more. Maybe I would still go for some additional crit chance item, maybe on some rings or weapons on shield. But I would start thinking about respeccing into Stormbrand. And like I said earlier, when it comes to Stormbrand, you can check out this document made by Zeeboub. It has a ton of information about Stormbrand, how to transition from Armageddon Brand into it, at what point, and so on, what is the progression. And here are some useful POBs. So for this video, I'm gonna use this POB, which is something I would probably have where I would consider to swapping to Stormbrand. He recommends using this POB, but I think I will stay with Armageddon Brand a little bit more, and I'm gonna wait until I have double cluster jewel set up, and at this point I'm gonna swap to Stormbrand. So for Stormbrand, what you want is you want to have two weapons with +1 lightning spell skills gems, because now we are obviously lightning instead of fire, and you want to use Impulsi. Impulsi is actually extremely good item early on for just clear when you're using Stormbrand, and to help you spread your shocks, you can use Storm's Gift. And you actually don't even need to have your Impulsa as a 6 link, you can have it as a 4 link, or maybe 5 link if you use something on it. But what I would recommend is going for a helmet with hypothermia and critical strike chance. And how to craft it, you can also check out this guide. You're gonna find the way how to craft this helmet. So with these two modifiers, you're basically gonna have like a 6 link. You can also use Essence for 30% more damage. So this way, if you get that with hypothermia and crit chance, you get even more damage. This helmet is the biggest investment when it comes to this build, and the most important part of playing Stormbrand. And because we are using hypothermia, we need to deal some cold damage, preferably a lot of cold damage, to trigger chill. So for that, we are using Call of Brotherhood to transform some of the lightning damage to cold. And this also helps a ton with defense, because Stormbrand is actually pretty squishy build. So thanks to this, you're going to be freezing your enemies a ton. And it is actually your main defense, and it helps a ton compared to Armageddon Brand. And also, as when you are playing Armageddon Brand, you are kind of a melee build because you're relying on your Brand Recall. With Stormbrand, you no longer rely on Brand Recall, which means you can stay away from enemies, which helps with damage uptime a ton. At this point, you also would swap from Hierophant to Inquisitor, which means we are full crit build, and also we are gonna have Consecrated Effect, which is gonna apply regen to both life energy and energy shield. So at this point, you would want to go for Glorious Vanity with Doriani, which gives the percentage of your life as energy shield. So you get a ton of energy shield. So you can go hybrid build. So you would go for Petrified Blood to reserve some of your mana to basically be low life all the time. Then you use Arrogance to reserve even more auras. And you go for Pain Attunement for more damage. For the caster jewels, you really want to have Blast Freeze and Storm Rider, and then for medium ones, you just go for Snowstorm and Widespread Destruction. For the flasks, he recommends using Bottled Faith, but it can be pretty expensive, but it's also extremely good because we are Inquisitor. We get a lot of our defense scaling and damage scaling from a concentrated ground, so it's pretty important to have it. But if you can't afford it, it's still fine to play Stormbrand even without it. A Serious Promise is gonna be pretty good for damage and for leech, and crit chance from a third flask, cast speed with Onslaught, and movement speed from Quicksilver. Okay, so I hope I explained everything. Obviously, during the league start, I'm probably gonna do some stuff differently because I'm just gonna check the economy, and if I notice that something that normally is expensive is suddenly cheap, I'm gonna go for it. or maybe something that normally I would expect to be cheap is for some reason gonna be expensive, so we'll have to see. But if you want more information, you can check out my stream at twitch.tv/ZenM. I'm gonna stream one last day before the league starts, some practice, and then obviously during league start you're gonna be able to see how I am gonna exactly progress this build. So that's gonna be it for today. Thanks for watching and see you next time.